Good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Dungan, and I'm the newest member of the professional learning team at Michigan Virtual. And so it is with great pleasure to have you all here this morning to learn more about building and maintaining relationships in the online space. And never has that been more important than certainly the past year. And is a great connection and segue to this session from Mitch's wonderful keynote this morning. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Ann Perez and Emily Sicilia, who will be your facilitators this morning for this session. Before we get started, just a couple reminders. Please have your microphones muted during the session. I will be monitoring the chat in the session. So if you have questions for Emily or Ann, please post them there and I will feed them forward for you. And you may also want to have a pen and or paper close at hand to jot notes or reflections during the session. And we'll do a little protocol at the end of today's session where you also may want something to write on or jot a couple notes on. I have posted the link to the session slide deck in the chat, so you can find that there. Also, feel free to use the reaction button during the call to raise your hand or clap or throw confetti for our presenters this morning. And with that, I will hand it, actually, Emily, can you go to the next slide? There we go. So today we are going to be talking about the what, the why, and the how of building and maintaining student relationships online. So learning about important characteristics in the teacher-student relationship, why relationships matter so much and how they influence the learning space, and how you can articulate what you might do to build or increase positive relationships in the classroom, no matter the medium. And with that, I will turn it over to Ann.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. We're gonna talk relationships. And if there was something that I was thinking while Mitch Album was speaking this morning at his powerful story was just how important that teacher-student relationship is. And so before we get started, I do wanna highlight that much of what we're presenting today comes from a fabulous resource called the Distance Learning Playbook. If you're not familiar with it, when you access the slide deck, we do have a direct link to it. This playbook has not only just given very practical strategies that we're going to share with you today about relationships, but it covers student-centered practices, formative assessments. Can't speak highly enough of it. So highly recommend if you're looking for a very quick resource to validate what you're already doing and push you a little further. So with that, we will take a look at what effect that teacher-student relationships can have in learning in the classroom. Before I get started, there was some research done, and it shows that the teacher-student relationship can have an effect size of a 0.48 on learning. Just for some reference, anything larger than a 0.4 is considered a significant effect. And so the fact that a 0.48 is just related to the teacher and the student relationship is huge. So what does this mean about teacher-student relationships? Well, they rely on effective communication and an ability to address issues that might strain the relationship. And in a classroom environment and with kids, there are various things that can obviously impact that. It's about setting fair expectations and being clear about that with our students and between students. It's about including our students in some decision making, right? Even beyond the lesson and activities, but when we're talking about norms or how we're setting up classrooms even. It's about holding students accountable. Students do look for us to kind of help set some boundaries for them. And so making sure that we're holding them accountable in behavior, in their learning, and partnering with them and anyone that supports them. And then it really is making sure that relationships are not destroyed when issues do arise. And this quote in this bubble from the playbook, it's just an important reminder. And depending upon where you've been this year, if you've been face-to-face or if you've been fully online or a mix of between, sometimes what we naturally do in the classroom, we're going to share some of those same things now, but they just look different in an online environment. And so it's really important that you consider and perhaps even reestablish some of those things that you did in your face-to-face classroom as you transition to online learning, or just constantly reinforce if you bounce between, just to keep our students aware of what makes a very positive student-teacher relationship. And so we're going to start talking about some key characteristics, again, of what you probably naturally might do in your face-to-face classroom, but perhaps given your circumstance, you've had to rethink a little bit. So teacher empathy. How do our students seek connections with us? We can do this a variety of ways. It's in personalization and checking in with our students, whether it's through office hours or perhaps other forms. And later on in our session, we'll go into more actionable items of how you might check in with students. It's sometimes sharing little personal tidbits about us. And perhaps if you've done some online learning, your students have probably seen into your home a little bit, maybe the animals that come and drop into the Zoom or other things. And all of that can help build the relationship. And sharing interests, your students sharing their interests with you and you highlighting those with your students, all to help build that connection of trust and the ways that your students will want to continue to seek that connection with you. Another characteristic is just through positive regard. We want to let our students know we care about them. And again, I thought one of the most powerful things Mitch said was when Maury asked him, what's your name? How do you want to be called? That's very important to us, right? Our names pronounced correctly. So knowing our students, knowing their names or nicknames, greeting them. I know my oldest high schooler right now, when he's doing his online learning and I hear his student greet him and he responds back, I know he feels seen, he feels heard in his online session, right? Trying to find opportunities for our students to hear our voice, right? That can be slightly more difficult in the online environment, but what are ways that we can record our voice, post it in different platforms for our students to hear from us? Giving compliments when possible. Again, that might lend itself more naturally in the face-to-face classroom if we see something. But again, trying to find those ways and reach out to our students and continually kind of build them up and let them know that they are working towards all the learning that they are going through this year. Genuineness. So this one, we want to show our students, how do we care about ourselves as a professional, right? Our students care that we are content experts. And so again, going to school, you might naturally have your teacher outfit or standard teacher uniform, if you want to call it. But at home, right, how are we presenting to our students that we're still in that mode, right? As simple as dressing professionally, still being curious with our students, asking those questions, trying to model for them that the online space that you've created for them is really a space for learning, that having them learn about themselves, the world, and each other, that this is a place that they want to be because learning will happen. And just recognizing and being mindful of time, right? Just always staying on track and being mindful of the schedule that our students have, especially if in an online environment. Next slide. Thank you. Another way that we can help build this relationship is through non-directivity. So a lot of the time we are building lessons and activities for our students, and sometimes we are directly leading them to their learning, but we also want to make sure that, that we hold their abilities in high regard. So we want to help students identify their strengths, their goals. Maybe it's not always us just naming them. trying to pose questions that aren't leading to maybe a one kind of answer, but allowing our students to critically think. And then again, inviting them into some shared decision making where they see that they have a voice and a choice. And then finally, encouraging that critical thinking. How are we helping set up our students to think, not just critically for themselves, but even with each other, fostering discussion from their peers so that they can fully explain their thought process, perhaps even including multiple opportunities that they can explain their thinking, whether it's in writing or perhaps in a discussion. And then, of course, when possible, building in some choice and some relevance that will help them feel a connection to their learning and increase their desire to continue that journey. And so I'm going to send it over to Jeff, who I think will get us started on a breakout.
Yeah, so we're going to take about 10 minutes to break out into smaller groups. I think you'll be in about groups of about 4 or 5. And so while you're in there, please take a moment to introduce yourself, since we're coming from many different places today. Who you are, what you do, and where you do it. And then take some time to discuss how you might establish or reestablish relationships with students, both online but also face-to-face, and which one of those maybe approaches transfer between the two and work in both. Okay, and so Emily, I think you'll be seeing a notification pop up on your Zoom screen. Simply press join. You will be redirected to your breakout. Okay, I think we are ready to get started. We hope that you were able to share ideas and strategies for how you establish and maintain your teacher-student relationships. We will now turn our attention to some tips that have proven valuable in building and fostering relationships. Before we do, I would just remind you to put your questions in the chat. We are monitoring that. And also a quick reminder to mute your microphone if you have not, but it looks like everybody is. And with that, I'll turn it over to Emily.
Jeff. So now we're going to get into we all know relationships are important, right? But really thinking about how we might build and foster those relationships. I know a lot of us are maybe moving from one setting to another, from online to face-to-face, or we're going back and forth. So hoping to provide you with some practical strategies that you can implement tomorrow with your students. I also want to encourage you to use the chat if you are saying, oh, I do that, this is what I do, because I think we've learned that teachers love hearing from one another rather from us. So please, I invite you to use the chat to share your experiences as we're kind of sharing these tips. Tip number 1, increasing touch points. Touch points, according to the distance learning playbook, are categorized by not just our interactions with students, either face-to-face or online, but also things like how we use the LMS to interact with our students, how we interact with our parents and the community, and even comes down to the directions that we provide our students when we aren't with them in that asynchronous instruction time. So really thinking about those touch points and increasing where we are throughout those. One way to do this is the simple, we call on students. I know there's a hesitancy. We don't want to make anybody uncomfortable, especially with, we don't know what's going on behind the screen, but really it's an equity issue about allowing all students to participate. So one tool I have here, well, first I'm going to go back in my face-to-face kindergarten classroom. I had the popsicle sticks, and those are a time-trued and tested strategy where you put everybody's name on a popsicle stick and you pull them out, and that's how we get some random order. And I will tell you, when it came to changing jobs, choosing partners, lining up, you could hear a pin drop in my kindergarten classroom because they were waiting on bated breath to hear whose name was going to be called. Also tip, don't use colored popsicle sticks because they memorize who has what color. And then that's the hard way. Anyway, one way we can do this is to use a wheel of names. Ooh, so you can add people's names to this list. You can see I have, some people might see their own name here, to this list, and you just tap it and it's spins away. And then you can also use like remove function. So if you called on somebody, it can remove that name so they don't get called on again until you've gone through everybody. Oh, and then you get a clap, a fun little clap. And then again, I can choose to remove that name or close it and keep it in there. So that's a wheel of names. Again, I encourage you to put what you might use in the chat. Looks like Danielle uses it. Google Classroom on your phone will allow for random draw as well. Awesome. Michael, thank you for calling out that popsicle sticks work just as well in the high school classroom as it does in my kindergarten classroom. Thank you. Another touch point is being available. So if you have some type of chat feature through your LMS, thinking about just popping like a direct message to your students, letting them know that you're there, like, hey, you know, you had a really great question during class. I just want to make sure that you're able to do what you need to do, just to pop in and let them know that you're there, that even though if you're on the other side of the screen, I'm still here for you. Just really nice ways to let them, like that safety net, that kid that always looks back. I know Anne Perez shares often, like her first grader will like turn and look back as he's going into school. Is mom still there? Is mom still there? That reassurance and just providing them that we are still there. I do want to make a note that all communication with students needs to go through your official apps and LMS and should be coordinated with your students' caregiver or their parents and guardians, and never directly to a student's personal device unless your school has a different policy. And it's always a good idea, if possible, to have an adult present during one-on-one calls or things of that nature, just for safety and liability reasons. So there's my disclaimer that I wanted to make sure I mentioned. Another way that we can increase touch points is by quality feedback, not just feedback, but quality feedback. At Michigan Virtual, we use the acronym REPLY, which I am looking at my notes right now. So REPLY stands for responsive feedback, effective, positive, learning, and because it couldn't say REPLIP for personal, the Y is you. So keeping that feedback personal and relatable. And then this link here for quality feedback just provides an Edutopia article, kind of restating what I just said, being specific, the sooner the better. So timeliness, addressing the learner's advancement towards a goal. You know where they want to go. I see you making that progress. Being careful. Remember, when we do it online, tone can be read in our words. So making sure that it does come off as positive, involving learners in the process. So there's just a resource for you. Another way to increase touch points is to be present in discussion boards. So to help further those discussions, to go deeper, or to also connect to your students' interests, right? If you know somebody likes Star Wars and you're studying physics, that might be a really good entry point. Like, had you thought about something physics related that I cannot draw upon right now because that is not my background, but I'm sure for you physics teachers, you could make that connection right away. And again, this is just a resource about best practices in discussion boards. Again, I'm just going to kind of go to the chat real quick and seeing, Anne, thank you for adding that responsive, effective, positive learning. And you, I want to, oh, Jackie, thank you for, I knew I could count on you. Star Wars and physics. I appreciate it. So again, if you have tricks or practices that you use to, you know, really foster that touch point in discussion boards, I know we have a lot of Michigan virtual teachers in this session as well. Please put it in the chat and share, you know, if you have a protocol that you follow, just to kind of help support one another. Another touch point, this kind of goes along with my Star Wars example, but to integrate students' interests into those lessons. The more we know about our students, the better we are able to connect what they're learning to their lives and making that meaningful, that why. They ask us why am I learning this? And the more I said, as we know our students, the better we are to able to connect those whys. I want to invite you in the chat again to put in any ways that you are intentional about adding students' interests. I know some people, if you're a math person and you do story problems and you add people, your students' names to the story problems. I know my kindergartners would go nuts if they saw somebody, even if it was a coincidence and hadn't been intentional, although you always pretend like it was intentional. but that their name came up in that story problem or something like that. Jackie's adding a bunch of support repository of feedback. Yes. So if you have some go-to phrases or things that you use, or having a repository of that is always helpful. Kara seconds that. Thank you. Then another way to integrate students' interest is to maybe have a space for some show and tell. So what that might look like online is we come together in our synchronous session on a Wednesday, and I've already had students sign up and say they want to share something. So bringing their interests again into the classroom and making it known. Maybe they're really good at playing the guitar and they want to play something for you. Or another way to do that that might not be as anxiety ridden of performing in front of the whole class is to using something like a Flipgrid where students can post there, and then maybe you can share that whole group with their permission during that show and tell time. Obviously, our littles love to talk about anything and everything that they can relate to. So I always made sure I did a show and tell, but thinking about that, keeping that practice in place, even in the online sphere. And then having conversations around students' strengths, goals, and their growth. So what are we good at? Where do we, where do we want to go? So knowing that, again, allows you to tie that back to what they're learning, making it relevant and providing that pathway. So going back to Mitch Album, talking and listening with our students and knowing them. I see Jackie also talked about Padlet, which is a great tool for synchronous. Lauren said she had a teacher who found Google Earth pics of students' houses and used them as his background. That's fantastic. What a great idea. I haven't heard that one. Sharing favorite dream pet or pets. Math problems, including the names of a student pet. Lauren, I hadn't thought about that. Allowing allowing them to pick which topics are covered, buying a car versus a house. That, Mandy, it sounds like keeping it relevant, right? Like, well, why do you need this? That's really getting into the why of what we're doing and keeping them engaged. Thank you for sharing. Keep it up. Awesome in the chat. Let's move on. Again, tying it back to Mitch Album about those one-on-one check-ins. I think he said it 4 or 5 times. And I'm like, did he see our slide deck before we did this? Because it just flows really naturally. Checking in on students and a one-on-one atmosphere. There's a lot of different ways we can do this. So one way might be a Flipgrid check-in. So you could have a different board. And I got this off Twitter, which Jeff will agree with me is one of the best places for professional learning. If you're not on Twitter, I highly recommend it. But this link shows how this teacher used a daily check-in with students. And so each student had their own board. And so it was like a private space between the teacher and the student, and they could post videos back and forth to one another. So that might be an asynchronous way to check in with your students. Daily check-in. So if you want to do a quick whip around for all your students, you could offer them a Google form, something similar to this. So here's the beginning of the day. How are you feeling? Do you have anything to tell me about school or outside of school? Were you able to find all the work? Do you need any help? What questions do you have? I've also, if you were in our previous session, we shared another check-in that asked about students' basic needs. Did you eat today? Did you get enough sleep? Some of these basic needs that we know students need to fulfill in order to be able to tackle these academic tasks that we're asking them. So lots of different ways to go with that. Another option for a 2-minute check-in, this can be done whole group, or you could take it a couple of different ways. This comes from I'm not going to show this, but it's from the National Education for Social Justice. So 2-minute check-in, essentially, if you were to do it in a whole room, you have one question and students give one answer. So this would be a good place for maybe a would you rather, or what's your favorite candy? And you would stand in a big circle, and you, the teacher, might start, and I might say peanut butter cups. And then I'd look to the next person and they'd say, and we just do a quick whip around. It's a cognitively light activity, so we're not really getting into content unless you feel like you could do a would you rather with the content. What that could look like online might be you call on students and they, would say candy, they could use the chat, they could unmute themselves and say it. Lots of different ways they could use a Flipgrid to say it. but that 2-minute connection keeps it light and you still learn something about one another. I'm gonna go to the chat real quick and put a resource in there. What will that, I think she just put that check-in, thank you. And
Yeah,
all
I
right.
just want to say, I put the direct link to the resource that we've used where you can actually copy the templates and then you can customize them too. So the one that Emily showed you is just in the view form right now, but you could go and copy it and then take off questions, modify questions. So that direct link is in the chat.
Thanks, Anne. Another touch point that you might have is an office hours. So maybe you have select times during the day where students can drop in and check in with you or ask for help, and you can do some just-in-time teaching, things like that. You might also require students to do a weekly 10-minute check-in. So maybe you have time during your day where they can sign up. I know I've used Calendly before, which is an app that we'll probably put in the chat, where students can sign up for a time and it syncs with my, we have Outlook calendar, so it syncs with my Outlook, but it would sync with your Google Calendar if that's what you use. And it offers available time. So it checks your calendar and then you can say, you can do a 10-minute check-in, a 15-minute check-in, but you can direct students there to sign up and it pre-populates, it can pre-populate a Zoom link or a Google Meet link. I know my husband does that with check-ins with his students. So it's a requirement for, he has a mentoring group that uses, that he asks that they check in weekly with him. And this is a really good spot too, when they, to address like goals and pathways and things like that. So a really good space to not only get to know your students, but also to make that learning relevant and provide them a pathway. Last one is using Google Voice. So a phone call, again, thinking about protecting ourselves for liability purposes, but using Google Voice to check in with students. We know that our older students aren't great on the phone and they're not always great on email, but hopefully they're getting a little bit better at that. But texting is their preferred medium, I believe. And so Google Voice allows that through a safe number. It's not your personal number, but again, just keeping liability purposes in the back of your head. So I see Amanda asked, how well do high school students respond to a 2-minute check-in? Amanda, that's a good question. I've seen it done in the elementary, but I had my own mentoring group and I did something similar, and it was like, what's your favorite fall drink? And they seemed to love it. And I always, or we did a would you rather, and if I disagreed with them, I would ask them to prove it, which would encourage them to maybe bring a snack in. But I've seen it done. I think high school students would enjoy that time too. I see that Mandy, let's see, I'm going to go back up to the top. Tara agrees Calendly is helpful. And yes, there is that thing that when you sign up, they sometimes forget that they've signed up. Absolutely. I did read somewhere where part of, it was the podcast that they were talking about, our Bright podcast, where one of the first things a school that has been one-to-one for a while is it teaches students to update alerts and to send reminders to themselves, both in their phone and on their device. And I thought that was a really good kind of onboarding activity, is to set reminders and to teach students to set reminders. So thinking about that, because that's a lifelong skill that I still use, right? Elizabeth mentioned Google Calendar appointments. I've never used that, but thank you for sharing. Google Voice has been good for Mandy. Talking points to contact parents and students. Rich, that is amazing. I would love to hear more about that. Sharon, a waterfall chat. Yes, distance learning playbook. So waterfall is where you have everybody respond in the chat. They don't push enter until you say waterfall, and then all the chats come. Cindy says stickers and personalized memes. High schoolers love it. So thank you for participating in the chat. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to give you more time to kind of collaborate and hear what everybody is doing in their own classrooms regarding these touch points and check-in.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone for your thoughtful comments in the chat. Please refer to that. I put a link to the slide that you're looking at currently on your screen. We're going to go into breakout sessions again for about 10 minutes. You'll have time to interact with, I don't know if it's the same group or a different one, Emily, maybe different. Either way. Okay, thank you. Either way, we're going to do a little protocol, reflecting protocol called 1 in 4. So on one piece of paper that I mentioned at the beginning of the session, or anywhere really, you can jot down a quick fact that maybe has come to mind during today's session, a question that maybe the session has raised in your mind, an aha moment, something that resonated with you, and most importantly, a call to action. What might be something you try out tomorrow or next week if you're online with students or staff members meeting in the online virtual space. So again, that link is in the chat to the slide. If you forget those 4 categories: fact, question, aha, and what is your action step going to be? Emily will put us into our breakouts now. Enjoy your time together and your discussions.
I do believe, do you have reaction items? What I would invite us to do is if anybody would like to share maybe some insights, or like Jeff mentioned from the breakout, a fact, a question, aha, or an action item, I invite you to use the reaction, maybe like the hand clap or something like that, if to indicate if you would like to share, and we'll just call on you. We do have about 5 minutes left. Christy, would you like to share with us?
I just was trying it out, but good job. We had a good time in our meeting with Christine and Aubrey. I don't have anything to share.
Thank you.
This is Nikki. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
We had a couple of good questions asked in our breakout session before we got cut off. But somebody was asking, they were just talking about how they work with special ed students and with lower level elementary students. And they said sometimes that the technology could actually be a barrier. So if they had 28 kids who were able to use the polling feature, the new shiny tool that they tried to use out in their classroom, it worked great for those 28 students, but for 2 students, they ended up feeling, more isolated, right? Because they weren't able to get the technology to work. And they were just kind of reflecting on that and wondering if anybody had any advice for when technology can actually be a barrier to that, and how to keep it simple.
I'm gonna open that up to the group. If anybody has thoughts that they want to share or suggestions. For a group, you can feel free to unmute yourself if you want to respond to Nikki's questions.
I don't know if this is a solution that's viable for everybody, but I know our school allowed a very small number of students to come into the building when we were remote to get their technology issues answered at school and be able to participate in the meetings and things like that. So that may be an option for some. And again, they capped the numbers and, kept them spread throughout the building. But that's how we were able to overcome that for our students that had the most need.
I wonder if creating a video that shows and models how to use that tool that you could send out to students, if that would be helpful.
There is a tool, and I will get it. I don't remember what it's called, but it does screenshot by screenshot, and it records exactly what you're supposed to do. And the students click on it and go through the motions, and it like highlights it in like pink. And so I'm going to find that resource. But that is something, Betsy, you kind of triggered my memory by saying that. Let me see if I can find it.
Zoom is also a great tool to make those screencasts as well. If you just start, it's kind of weird because you start a call by yourself. So you'll be talking to yourself, which can be a little funny the first time you do it. But if you share your screen with yourself, you can walk people through. Just make sure to remember to record your session. And then you can send that recording out. it's also nice because the kids get to see your face in there. So that reduces some of that distance as well when you're walking them through that. So.
That's great. Thank you, guys.
Anyone else like to share out?
Angel?
Angel.
I just wanted to say, we talked a little bit about like how keeping up and having time to collaborate is like so huge right now, because essentially things like this, having a moment where you can talk to other people from outside of your district and hear what's working for them and what they've discovered. Things are changing so quickly right now that I feel like that's a fact. Collaboration is so necessary, and it has to be almost, it seems like almost weekly. So like teachers I know that are outside of my own district, people that I went to college with, or, you know, have left and went to other places, staying in contact with them and having chats about what is working and what, you know, wins they're having, is really pivotal to success, I think, right now. So I wanted to thank you guys for this opportunity to like network and talk to friends and share some solidarity.
Thank you, Angel. We appreciate that feedback. We know teachers want to talk to each other, so we try and just create that ability and then get out of the way. This was the tool I was talking about. It's called iorad.com, and there is a payment feature. But you can create these like really awesome tutorials, and it walks, like they do it for you. You just kind of go through the process, and there's also an audio function so it can read the directions to you. Really good resource. And I will add that to our slide deck as well.
Yeah, Emily, I just put that in the chat window. If you go to Event Owl, we do have a little chat window on the page for this session where you click the Zoom link. So I did add the URL into the chat there.
Thank you. It is time. We're actually over. I just want to take a moment and say thank you so much. Thank you for what you do every day for reaching and teaching our kids. You don't get nearly the praise and appreciation that you deserve. And so anytime we can say that to you, please know that we, as parents, as fellow educators, we're thankful to have you in the field and that you're taking time to continue to sharpen your craft, because it is a craft and an ongoing one. So thank you for your time and your patience this year, and we wish you the best. Enjoy the rest of the conference.